Namaskar, Jai Jinendra. I welcome you all to the second lecture under the monthly lecture series by International School for Jain Studies, Pune, India. Before I proceed, I would like to request our research associate, Ms. Pragya Jain, to recite Navkar Mantra. Pragya ji.
जय जिनेन्द्र। नमो अरिहन्ताणं नमो सिद्धाणं नमो हरियाणं नमो वज्रायाणं नमो लोये सवसाहूणम् एसो पंचनमोकारो सवपावपणासनो मंगलाणं च सव्वेसिं पढमं हवै मंगलम् तुभ्यं नमस्त्रिभुवनार्तिहराय नाथ तुभ्यं नमः क्षितितलामलभूषणाय तुभ्यं नमस्त्रिजगतः परमेश्वराय तुभ्यं नमो जिनभवोदधिशोषणाय।
Thank you, Pragya. Thank you.
Friends, as you know, since its inception in 2005, ISGS is actively involved to introduce academic study of Jainism in the universities globally. And for last 4 or 5 years, ISGS is actively engaged in the promotion of Prakritic language as well. For both Jain studies and study of Prakrit language, we offer different types of programs. During summer, we offer 3-week course and 5-week course on Jain studies and 3-week course on non-violence and peace based on philosophies of Gandhi and Jainism for school teachers. In winter, we offer a 10-day course on fundamentals of Jainology. I will not go in detail. All the details are available at our website. And similarly, on Prakrit language, we offer many short-term and long-term programs. So if you are interested, you can visit our website. Initially, our audience were mainly from USA and overseas countries. But for last 3-4 years, scholars from India have also started taking participation in our various programs. So we here at ISGS thought that our audience from India must know how Western scholars think about Jainism. What is their observation? What is their approach to see Jainism? And on the other hand, our overseas friends must also know the approach of Indian scholars, the methodology of Indian scholars, how they see Jainism, how they practice Jainism, how they think about Jainism. And thus, with this objective, we started a monthly lecture series on Jainology. And first lecture series, and the first lecture under the series was delivered by Professor Jeffrey DeLong, a renowned scholar of South Asian philosophy and religion from Elizabethton College, Pennsylvania, USA. And today, here, we are here for the second lecture under the series by Professor Robert Zydenbos on the worship of goddesses in Jainism. Dr. Zydenbos is a professor of Indology at the Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich, Germany, where he teaches Indian philosophy and religions and Kannada and Sanskrit languages. One thing which I would like to tell about Professor Zydenbos is that he has spent 17 years in India and he is an alumni of University of Madras. So we are very fortunate to have Professor Zydenbos with us as today's speaker. Right now, Professor Zydenbos is out of station. He's not in Germany. He's in Indonesia. But he's so kind that he accepted my request to deliver this speech. Sir, behalf of myself, behalf of ISGS, I welcome you. Our president and founder, Dr. Suganchan Jain, is the chairperson of this session. All the activities being conducted and organized by ISGS is due to the inspirations, guidance, and support by our president, Dr. Suganji, who has dedicated his life for the promotion and study of Jainism. Sir, I welcome you to this online platform of ISGS. I welcome our co-founder, Dr. Sulekhji. I welcome our friends from Oriental Institute, Russia. I welcome Professor Jayanti Lalji, Abha Jainji, and our friends from India and overseas. I welcome you all here for the second lecture under the series on different aspects of Jainology. And we are very fortunate to have a very renowned scholar of Indian philosophy and religion and Indian languages, Professor Robert Zydenbos. Without any other formalities, I request Professor Zydenbos to deliver his talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. As Dr. Pandey mentioned right now, at the moment, I am in an interior village in Indonesia, and I hope that everything runs well, that there will not be any interruptions in the connection which I have with all of you, and that you will be able to hear me and see what I want to show you. So, now, first of all, before coming to the main part of my presentation, I would like to give a few introductory remarks. The phenomenon of goddess worship, Yakshiaradhana, in Jainism is a matter of interest for several reasons. Commonly, it is dismissed by scholars as mere folk religion, or as an aspect of tradition that is often seen as not essentially Jaina, or perhaps even non-Jaina, un-Jaina, and contrary what is thought to be the true spirit of the religion. But it remains a highly popular part of the everyday religiosity of Jaina lay people in more than one of the four main traditions which are recognized in Jainism today. Now, in today's presentation, I will tell about the foremost center of goddess worship in Karnataka, which is traditionally the intellectual homeland of Digambara Jainism, to illustrate the character of this phenomenon to those listeners who are as yet not familiar with it. Much of what I will say applies also to the worship of Yakshis in northern India, with differences that are mainly differences in style and not in essence, not in belief or a reason why such worship exists in the first place. I speak about Karnataka because I lived in Karnataka for a long time, and therefore I feel that I can speak with more authority about that than with the practice in other parts of India. I will place this in a broader historical context of Southern Jainism and also discuss why it exists at all, whether it may be justly considered an integral part of Jaina religiosity, to what extent it can be considered an import from Hinduism, and what it signifies with regard to the relationship between Jainism on the one hand and Hinduism on the other. I was invited to give this talk at very short notice, and surely some people in my audience will recognize that I'm drawing much material which I used in a lecture which I gave in Los Angeles a year ago. But I have more time to speak here, so it will be an extended version. And I'm speaking in front of a very mixed audience, and this is always a challenge. Now, I assume that much of what I will be telling you today is already known by the Jaina part of the audience, or the more generally Indian part of the audience, but it may be entirely new for other parts of the audience. This is a challenge, but I hope that I will succeed in striking a balance and that I will offer something new to everybody. I would like to tell you a bit of autobiography about how I came to be interested in the phenomenon of goddess worship in Jainism, and also why I believe it is a topic that deserves serious study. Back in the year 1983, I began to live in India for a longer period of time. I stayed there until the year 2000, 17 years. And I had a number of very ambitious intentions. I had studied Sanskrit, Indian religions, Indian philosophy, a few other Indian languages in the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And in the course of my studies of Indian thought, I became particularly interested in Jainism. Now, at that time, Jainism was relatively less studied than the other intellectual traditions of India. What was commonly known about Jainism at that time in academic circles in Europe was based on the work of only a relatively small number of scholars who had mainly studied oldest Jaina literature, particularly the Agama literature. And it was only after I came to India that I realized, and I know this may sound a bit ridiculous, especially to the Indian listeners in today's audience, that Jainism is much more than what is found in the Jaina Agamas and in a few philosophical texts. Of course, the study of such texts is important. But a living religious tradition is more than what is found in the oldest texts of that tradition. If one wishes to understand the inner dynamics of a living religious faith or of a philosophical tradition, one must see how it develops in the course of time, and also how it responds to general changes in the social and intellectual environment in which that tradition lives. And because until most recently, the number of researchers of Jainism outside India has been quite limited, there was not much manpower available to study the whole of Jainism. And these limited resources were used for the concentrated study of the earliest historical records of Jainism, which in itself is very sensible. However, the resulting image of the tradition remains incomplete. I had seen, when I was a student, only one book, which at the time was already a few decades old, about Jaina Mantra Shastra. It contained the text of the Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa. And at the time, my impression was this had to be an odd fringe phenomenon, something really at the very edge of the religion. Because my idea of Jainism was that of a very sober, ascetic tradition of rather otherworldly people with a very philosophical bent of mind and a tendency to lead rather austere lives of renunciation. And there seemed to be very little place there for what appeared to be a medieval, magical baroqueness that seemed to characterize the venerations of goddesses such as Padmavati, about whom I will speak. And when I first encountered living Jainism in Karnataka, I was bewildered, but also fascinated. There was evidently an enormous part of living Jaina religiosity about which academic scholars in the Western world knew practically nothing. At the same time, the ritual practices around the veneration of the goddesses were so ordinary for the Jaina people whom I met that they could hardly understand why I did not know about it. As I became more familiar with the tradition and learned more about it, I came to realize that in its own way, this tradition makes very good sense within the totality of Jaina thought. Not only have the yakshas and yakshis been present in Jaina literature from the very beginning, but they have religiously very meaningful functions within the religion. The tradition has often been belittled by both Indian as well as foreign scholars as a corrupting import from Hinduism. But I'm convinced that this view is unjust for more than one reason, and I will have to return to this matter later on in this talk. I think I would like to start sharing my screen with you. Yeah. Good, this should work. As I mentioned earlier, the academic study of Jainism in the Western world has till now remained focused on Jaina philosophy and the so-called high religion that finds its expression in the veneration of the monks and the nuns, tyagis, who are the supreme religious authorities in the Jaina community. But Jainism was also the religion of some of the greatest and historically most important royal families in the Kannada-speaking part of India. I will speak for convenience sake about Karnataka. Among them, we find the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, also the Ganga dynasty, to whom we owe the colossal image of Bahubali and Shravanabelagola. And the goddess Padmavati plays a role in the founding myth of the mighty Hoysala dynasty. It is said that the founder of the dynasty, one Sala, as a young man, was attacked by a tiger. And his guru, a Jaina monk, told him to strike the tiger in self-defense using the Kannada word poi, which means to hit, to strike. And Sala did that. And then it turned out that it was not a tiger, but it was the goddess Padmavati who had assumed the form of a tiger to put Sala's courage to the test. And when I first wrote about the worship of Jaina goddesses almost 30 years ago, many of my readers were puzzled. The common reaction was to dismiss the phenomenon as not genuine Jainism, because it seemed to contradict some fundamental Jaina ideas. It was assumed to be something fundamentally alien, as I said earlier, an import from Hinduism, whatever that may mean. And this judgment seems to be supported by several critical authors, modern as well as classical. On the other hand, we have modern authors like contemporary Muni, Kuntusagara Muni Maharaj, who in one book has noted that numerous classical authors not only approved, but actually encouraged the practice of Yakshi worship. In theory, there are 24 Yakshis, as the so-called goddesses of Jainism are referred to. They have 24 male counterparts, the Yakshas. And these 24 pairs of Yakshas and Yakshis are considered the attendants, the assistants of the 24 Tirthankaras. For reasons that are not yet clear, only 3 among these 24 are widely worshipped. Very rarely there is mention of a 4th one. The other 20 play practically no role in contemporary religious practice. Now, these 3, the 3 main Yakshis, have clearly very different personalities, and therefore they attract different kinds of devotees. Padmavati worship, you see here an older classical depiction of the Yakshi Padmavati. Padmavati worship is spread throughout Karnataka, and popular shrines dedicated to her are found in various locations. But the main shrine for Padmavati is found in Umcha in central Karnataka. This is a small village. Now it is a small village, but once it was the capital of the very long-lived Santara dynasty. The town has had many names in the course of its long history. It was first called Patipumpulcha Nagara, then it became Pumpulcha, then it became Pumcha, then it became Humbuja. That is the name which is today used by most Jainas in Karnataka. And officially, the modern name is Umcha. The main temple of Padmavati, here you see the temple, was built in the year 1062 by Trailokya Malavira Santara. This was almost the same time when Malishena Suri wrote his tantric work, Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa. But the temple in Humbuja was not the first in Karnataka. A stone inscription tells us that in approximately 490 AD, Ravi Varma, one of the rulers of the nebulous Kadamba dynasty, about which we know very little, had a temple for Padmavati constructed in the village of Kaleli. Several old Padmavati temples have been taken over in the course of time by various other religious communities. This is said to be the case, for instance, with the famous Mahalakshmi temple of Kolhapur, the Sharadamba temple in Sringeri, and the Renuka Yellamma Devi Devasthana in Saundatti, which now is dedicated to a goddess Yellamma and is known as the center of the notorious Devadasi practice, which is now claimed to have been eradicated. There is, of course, a story why Humbuja should be the site of the main shrine. It is told that there was a Jaina kingdom in northern India with the capital Madurai. It was ruled by a king named Sakara, whose only queen, Sriyadevi, was from the other Madura, the southern Madura, now located in the state of Tamil Nadu. By the grace of Padmavati Devi, their son Jinadatta is born. Many years later, the king falls in love with the daughter of a savage tribal chieftain, and he marries her as a second wife. The people of Madurai are so shocked about this that he must ask and receive the forgiveness of the family guru, the Muni Siddhantakirti. The king also decides to abdicate in favor of his son Jinadatta, who becomes the new ruler. But under the influence of his second savage wife, he cultivates bad habits, such as eating meat. The second wife plots to kill Jinadatta, but the plot fails, and her own son is killed instead. Jinadatta, who realizes that the situation around him is quite dangerous, flees southwards to his uncles in the southern Madurai, and he takes with him the murti of the goddess Padmavati. But halfway south, in the middle of the forest, the goddess tells him in a dream not to go any further. A group of tribal hunters accepts him as their king. And immediately, on the spot, they begin building the capital of a new kingdom. That is now Humbuja. The goddess also gives Jinadatta advice on how to be a good ruler. And in order to finance the new kingdom, she says that if any metals are touched to her murti, these metal objects will be turned into gold. Later, Jinadatta's mother, together with the Munis Siddhantakirti, join him in this new city of Humbuja. His mother insists that he should marry both his female cousins from the southern Madurai. Years later, Jinadatta angers Padmavati by an act of ingratitude. But she says that in this Panchamakala, the age known in Jaina cosmology as Dusama, such weaknesses are common. and he is a mere victim of circumstances. However, her magic murti will disappear, and instead of this image, a new stone image of her will appear in the temple. After some time, Jinadatta abdicates in favor of his son. He becomes a monk, and both his wives become nuns. This story of Jinadatta has found its official, so to say, most elaborate form in the long narrative poem Jinadattaraya Charitra, also called the Padmavati Mahatmya, by the poet Padmanabha Kavi, written rather late, around the year 1680 AD. There are also many popular modern versions, prose versions, and the story has also inspired a large number of folk songs, also lullabies that are sung in central Karnataka, in which the child that is sung to sleep is told to be like Jinadatta, who was protected by the goddess as long as he led a virtuous life. Some stories about Padmavati show quite different sides of her personality, as in a folk tale, which was told to me and is also recorded in what is still the most important book on Jaina folk literature in the Kannada language. One story is the story of Guhya Padmavati, or the Padmavati of the cave, which in summary goes as follows. In Shravana there is a young shepherd who is herding his sheep one day near a hillock. And one of the sheep runs off through a crevice in the side of that hillock. The shepherd creeps in after the sheep into a cave and grabs it by its tail. But the sheep insists to pull the shepherd further into the cave. Together they pass through 9 different doorways. And then the sheep and the shepherd finally reach a large room where he sees a goddess seated on a golden swing that hangs from silver chains, and he's gripped with fear. But the goddess tells him not to be afraid, and she will show him the way out, but only on one condition. The condition is that he will tell nobody that she is there. And if he does tell anyone, so she says, his head will burst. Also, she gives him as a present 3 stones, which he must take home and place in 3 different containers for ragi, rice, and money. And if he performs a very simple puja to these 3 stones every day with a simple incense stick, he will become a wealthy man. Everything happens exactly as the goddess said it would. The people in the village begin to wonder where all this sudden wealth of the shepherd comes from. They become extremely curious, and they put him under extreme pressure to tell them. But he pretends that he does not know the reason. However, his wife does not give up so easily. He tells his wife that if he tells her, his head will burst. But curious as his wife is, she keeps insisting. Finally, he grants her her wish, tells her the story of the source of his wealth, and immediately his head bursts and he dies. Every year, on the day of Phalguna Krishna Paksha Ashtami, according to the Indian lunar almanac, that is the Mula Nakshatra day, the Maharatotsava, or a great car festival, in honor of Padmavati takes place in Mobuka. This is usually in the month of March or April. This is followed by a Mahabhisheka with 108 kalashas for Tirthankara Parshvanatha on the following day. This is an annual temple festival, which altogether lasts 9 days. Here you see an example of an invitation. This is the 2021 invitation to the Varshikotsava. And approximately 18,000 to 20,000 people come to Hombuja on this occasion, mainly from the surrounding area, but also from other parts of Karnataka, other parts of India, from as far as Manipur and Assam, but also from places such as New Zealand and the United States. On the final evening of the car festival, many people crowd together around a decorated Manastamba in front of the Padmavati temple. And in the general manner of Indian car festivals, the presence of the goddess has been transferred from the main murti in the temple to her portable Utsava murti, which has been carried and placed in the temple ratha, the temple car, and is pulled in procession through the village. After the ratha and the goddess return to the temple in the evening, the main priest, here you see a picture of the Utsava murti of Padmavati. The main priest takes the Utsava murti from the ratha and proceeds to the Manastamba, to the tall pillar of which you saw the base earlier in a former picture. A traditional eightfold veneration of the goddess follows, consisting of 8 double circumambulations of the Manastamba, during which 8 musical performances are offered to the goddess. The performers circumambulate, walking backwards, facing the goddess, who, carried by the main priest, follows. After the 8th offering, it is time for the goddess to return to the temple. Against the background of loud music by all the musicians, the priest begins to tremble. Here you see one of the musicians walking backwards around the Manastamba. When it is time for the goddess to return to the temple, the priest begins to tremble in a trance. He tries to enter the temple, but he is not in full control of his movements. After several attempts, he succeeds in entering the temple. This is from inside the main hall. He succeeds in entering this hall, and he rushes through it to the entrance of the Garbhagriha, the main shrine, where other priests take the Utsava murti from him, and he is dragged off through the side exit of the temple, where he is fanned and resuscitated, and he is released from his trance. Behind the curtain in the Garbhagriha, the other priests ritually transfer the presence of the goddess back to the main murti. Then the curtain is opened again, and under the ringing of all the bells of the temple, a magnificent arati is performed, which you see here. Most of the people who attend the festivities are not Jainas. They are followers of other religions. They're from Hombuja, they're from the surrounding area. And it is clear that for them, it is not Parshvanatha Swami, but his attendant Yakshi Padmavati, who is the central personality of the 9-day celebrations. We also find Padmavati's presence elsewhere, where Parshva, whose assistant she is, plays practically no role at all. For instance, in the majestic Bandari Vasthi in Shravana Belgura. Also in Dharmasthala, you have another picture from Shravana Belgura, Bandari Vasthi. Also in Dharmasthala, another important multi-religious place of worship in southwestern Karnataka. On a hill at the edge of the town, there stands an old, but recently radically renovated temple dedicated to Chandranatha. Actually, it is very clear who is the main focus of the temple. Here you have the main image of Chandranatha. If you see this, then it appears immediately clear whose temple this is, who is the important personality here. However, typically, there is an auxiliary shrine within the Garbhagriha, so in the same space where you see the main image of Chandranatha, there's another image directed in a 90-degree angle. And visitors can have darshana of this murti through a side entrance. Here you see the decorated side entrance of the temple, a large festo, where the Jaina populace decided it was appropriate to also purify this temple. Here you see that entrance from another angle, and inside you see small light burning. This is what you see when you look into the Garbhagriha from that side entrance. And the main object here is this murti. And by now you will already have understood who this is. And so here you have a close-up of the image of Padmavati. And during the festivities, I was also able to make a few short films where I saw a priest carrying the Utsava Murti of Padmavati around through the town of Dharmasthana in a state of possession. Here you have a few visual impressions of that, of the main priest screen. One moment, I think I have to start this again. One moment. Share screen. Try again. Okay, I hope this looks better. Yeah. Right, so returning to Padmavati. Now, she is, so to say, a largely independent deity in her own right. And the reasons for her popularity become clear when one learns for what reasons she is venerated. The late Padmanabha Jaini, our colleague at the University of Berkeley, told me long ago that his mother had named him after the poet, Padmanabha Kavi, because, like Jinadatta of the poem, Padmanabha Jaini was considered a boon from the goddess at Ombuja. Several inscriptions testify that various ruling families in the Kannada-speaking region of India considered themselves to be Padmavati Devi Labdavara Prasadaru, or blessed by the boons that were granted by Padmavati Devi. Now, whether the worship of the goddesses is Hindu or not is, whether it is an import from Hinduism or not, of course, depends on how one defines Jainism. It is not quite so simple as it may seem at first sight. One possible approach is what I call the social sciences approach, which says that Jainism is what Jaina people do. And this may appear obvious, but it is not. First of all, because what Jaina people do in their religious practice may differ very strongly from one particular tradition within the Jaina community to the next. And there's also a logical error involved here, because it assumes that there already is an agreement on what Jainism is. And let us see whether we can show this again without interruptions. And there's also, oh, I need to do that, Sharon. This, There's also a logical error involved in the social sciences approach, because it assumes that there already is an agreement on what Jainism is, because only then you can say these are Jaina people. The other approach of earlier generations of Indological scholars was a selectively textual one, taking Jainism to be based on a set of ideas that are found in certain ancient texts that are considered authoritative. For rather coincidental reasons, the Shvetambara Agamas were considered such texts, and any ideas that were introduced in later texts that were not thus contained in the Agamas were considered aberrations or corruptions of what was considered true Jainism. But there is more than one problem in this approach as well. First of all, it does not recognize the nature of the Agamas, which are mainly handbooks for the Tyagyins, for the monks and nuns, and not for the majority of Jainas who are lay people. Secondly, this approach implicitly denies the reality of dynamic development within Jainism as a living religious tradition. Now here I wish to emphasize that until recently, the academic study of Jainism by non-Jaina scholars was selectively textual, focusing mainly on the oldest texts and on a few later philosophical classics, for instance, the writings of Kunda and the Tattvartha Sutra. Other factors are the very limited contacts between these few scholars in the past with living representatives of Jaina religiosity, both lay people as well as traditional scholars. And the fact that Jainism today is a relatively small religious minority in India disguises Jainism's great importance for the history of Indian culture. And it is only very recently that, happily, an increasing number of researchers worldwide are showing greater interest in it. In my opinion, the question, what is Jainism, is best answered as a collection or body of ideas that are shared by a certain group of people as an orientation in life. And this body of ideas is not monolithic, it is not uniform, but it allows for various variations within certain boundaries, as long as certain core ideas in metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology are not contradicted. And this is, in fact, what is implicitly accepted by Jainas today. The rise of the four main sampradayas in their institutionalized form, recognized by all Jainas, can be explained only in this manner. There is a certain, we can say, unity in diversity within Jainism that permits variation and innovation. And one naturally expects this from a living tradition that responds to new questions that arise in the course of time. Characteristically, the question of the existence of spiritual beings and their relationship to humans, which is one of the topics of the Tattvartha Sutra, namely in chapter 4, has received different treatment at the hands of different commentators in various times. If we take, for instance, the classical commentary Sarvartha Siddhi by Pujapada, who lived around 500 AD, the commentary to this particular chapter, number 4, where the existence and the character of gods is discussed, that commentary is about 8 pages long in print. However, 7 centuries later, we find a commentary in Old Kannada by one Balachandra Deva called the Tattvaratna Pradipika. And in that commentary, the section about that chapter 4 of the Tattvartha Sutra is not 8 pages, but 50 pages long in print, which clearly indicates that in the course of time, there was a shift of interest, and other contents, which we already find in the original Tattvartha Sutra, received more special treatment. Now, nevertheless, the tradition of veneration of Yakshis has remained a contentious matter also because it seems to play a role in recognizing Jainism as a religious and philosophical tradition that is distinct from the religious complex, which is known today as Hinduism. Especially in the social sciences, there have been modern authors who claim that there is no such thing as a truly distinct Jaina culture, because what is perceived is mainly a kind of class psychology of a community that consists of businessmen, but actually they are a kind of Hindus. Now, this is, of course, a gross oversimplification of Jaina history to the point of distortion. And it denies the fact that still today, a large part of the Jaina community in southern India consists not of businessmen, but of landowners and agriculturists. Just as in the past, there have been numerous noble families that became the rulers of parts of India. Obviously, Jainism, just like Buddhism, held a special appeal for people in commercial professions because of this very strong emphasis on individual responsibility, initiative, and enterprise, typical commercial values. But the stereotype of the Jainas as a purely merchant community is a modern stereotype that is based on the contemporary social situation in parts of northern India. It denies both historical reality across the whole of India, as well as the social reality in southern India. Basically, Jainism is a comprehensive religious tradition that is open for anyone and everyone, and it is not the preserve of any specific section of society. And that certain social scientists today make claims to the contrary is just one example of why I am skeptical about the social sciences in general, and their research disregards history and focuses geographically too narrowly. My colleague, Professor John Court, whom we may consider the leading living Jainism researcher in North America, also sees a problem in the tradition of the veneration of yakshis and other such non-human beings. Court wrote a study about the veneration of Gandakarna Mahavira in Gujarat, a similar deity. And he sees a curious divide, a gap within Jaina thought, with on the one hand, what he calls a concern for well-being in the world, and on the other hand, what he calls the moksha marga ideology. Court uses the term ideology in a rather literal, neutral sense, without the negative connotation that is usually attached to the word ideology in ordinary, everyday speech. For him, an ideology is a set of claims that are not in agreement with what we may consider common sense. Ideas that are not supported by common experience and therefore have a disruptive and irritating character when they are asserted as a truthful and accurate description of reality. Now, this in itself is not a denial that such an ideology helps people to orient themselves in life and thereby live more fruitful and happier lives. Ultimately, we find this in each and every religion. Court sees the moksha marga ideology as basically a program of renunciation, with the tyagis as the persons who apply the ideology to its fullest possible and most consistent extent. And he sees a rather glaring contrast between the underlying devaluation of whatever is worldly, which is the basis of tyaga, of renunciation, and on the other hand, the veneration of these lesser deities, such as the yakshis, who are venerated precisely because they help in the here and now of everyday worldly life. In other words, they are very much involved in samsara and are not a part of the moksha marga. Well, this idea is not new in itself. We already find it as an objection in earlier Jaina authors. We find it very forcefully condemned by the 18th century Digambara lay author from Rajasthan, Todarmal, in his widely read book, Moksha Marga Prakashaka. Now, another serious methodological problem in most Jaina studies in the social sciences lies in a sort of, I would call it, impatience, which leads to the projecting of alien and unsuitable theories onto Jainism. It would be much more appropriate, I believe, to approach the matter from within Jaina thought, using concepts that have been presented by ancient Jaina authors, who evidently, like Umaswati in his Tattvartha Sutra, recognized the existence of various categories of devas. And already in the 2nd century, Kundakundacharya wrote elaborately about the 2 fundamental nayas, or way of understanding practically anything, which he called Nichayanaya and Vyavaharanaya, or in Sanskrit, Nishchayanaya and Vyavaharanaya, a practical point of view and an absolute point of view. We have here a very close parallel to the 2-level approach of reality in the distinction between 2 versions of the 5 basic vows of Jainism, the Mahavratas, or great vows, on the one hand, and the Anubratas, or minor vows, on the other. And there's no essential contradiction in this. As long as one decides, for whatever reason, to remain a part of the conventional social world, as a member of a family, as part of an economic system, etc., the Anubratas, these small vows, apply. And it is only when one decides to renounce the world, to renounce possessions, social ties, etc., that the Mahavratas apply. Similarly, as long as one remains within conventional Vyavaharika society, it is only natural that one has dealings with other persons, that these people help each other in tackling the problems of everyday practical life. And the veneration of Yakshis is a recognition of human limitations, a realization that there are practical, mundane problems that ordinary humans cannot solve, and where the help of superhuman beings with special abilities would be very welcome. Now, I do not want to discuss the question how real the yakshas are, to what extent they are real the way you and I are real, material, tangible, objective beings. We have old writings about them. We have records in orally transmitted folk literature. And I have met people who were convinced that they had been contacted by yakshis in dreams, in visions, or that a yakshi has beneficially intervened in their lives. I've already mentioned Padmanabh Jaini, whose mother was convinced that it was through a boon from the goddess that he was born. Now, I'm not in a position to answer the question whether such claims are objectively true, or whether they are the result of wishful thinking, or perhaps delusions. Such questions belong to an entirely different field of studies. That is a matter of parapsychology. However, it is far easier to recognize the psychological value of the tradition within the whole of Jaina religious practice, and to determine whether this tradition is in fundamental conflict with core ideas of the Jaina worldview or not. Now, the everyday psychological value is immediately visible. The notion that very often we suffer under forces that are beyond our control, but that this does not mean that we are entirely helpless. This is, of course, a major reason for the enormous popularity of the great typical bhakti religions like Christianity and Islam. And even if skeptics like to make fun of Jesus or Krishna as imaginary friends, the fact is that such a felt friendship, irrespective of how real or unreal the friend is, can be of great emotional support and inspiration to the believer. The question why the veneration of the female yakshis is clearly so much more popular than that of the male yakshas can be answered very quickly, because here we have an obvious example of the near universal polar religious gender symbolism. I must warn you, any projection of modern feminist ideas on goddess worship is completely out of place here. In case anyone has such suspicions. If the Tirthankaras represent the realized ideal of the moksha marga and are liberated and they are beyond this world, and if they are male, then the beings who assist us in the world are not male, but female. They're the polar opposite. We find parallels in other religions of India, that the opposition between Shiva and Parvati or Vishnu and Lakshmi. We should also note that however much the Yakshis are venerated by Jaina people, they're revered, they are loved, but the believers are always aware that these goddesses are mortal beings. They are subject to the laws of samsara, to the laws of karma. They cannot help us achieve moksha, for instance. This becomes especially clear in a story such as that of how a woman became another Yakshi, namely Jvala Malini, as a result of meeting an older Yakshi, namely Padmavati, who instructed this woman about how to lead a virtuous life and gain good karma so that she would be reincarnated as a Yakshi. Padmavati herself, in her previous life, was a snake who acquired good karma through listening to the words of Parshvanatha. The relative status of the Yakshis versus that of the Tirthankaras is also expressed in details of temple ritual. For instance, during the Avahana, that is the calling down of the divine presence into the Murti, a priest will call upon a Tirthankara using the words avatara, descend, descend, whereas a Yakshi is never called in that way, but is called with the words agacha, come, come. Architecturally, the shrine of the Yakshi is always next to the main shrine, which is that of the Tirthankara. So the hierarchy between the Tirthankaras and the Yakshis is extremely clear. Now, coming to a broader religious context, the American anthropologist Lawrence Babb has made a very interesting comparison of religious ritual in three different Indian religious cultures: the Shvetambara Jaina, the Pushti Marga Vaishnava, and the Shaiva Siddhanta in Tamil Nadu. And he concluded that there is a deeper, fundamental, underlying unity among them, which he refuses to call either Jaina or Hindu. He calls it South Asian. He notices a very, very obvious, externally visible similarities in ritual practice between these three traditions. But in each of them, the theoretical interpretation of the meaning and the efficaciousness of ritual is different. Although Babb points out a very great similarity between the Jaina worship of the Tirthankara and the worship of Shiva in Shaiva Siddhanta, in that ritual is reflexive rather than transactional. The worshipper intends to acquire the characteristics of the Jina in Jainism, or to become a Shiva in Shaiva Siddhanta, rather than that he expects his object of worship to do something for him. Yakshi worship, on the other hand, appears transactional, more like what is found, for instance, in Vaishnava traditions, but it is still firmly embedded within Jaina theory. This underlying South Asian unity seems truly extremely ancient. As the Shvetambara Agama show, the veneration of Yakshas and Yakshis already existed at the time of Mahavira. This unity is also the basis of interreligious exchange and harmony. As I said, most pilgrims who come to places like Hombuja or like Simhanagari, the main shrine of Jvala Malini Devi, are not Jainas. And nobody minds, not in the least. On the contrary, all pilgrims are welcome, and their participation fosters interreligious respect and harmony. Now, many earlier authors on the subject of Yaksha worship Here you have another picture of and yes, here you have another picture, older picture of the image of Padmavati in Homboja. Many earlier authors on the subject of yaksha worship have spent much time and effort discussing questions of the origins of the practice, and usually they were eager to assert that yaksha worship was a borrowing from Hinduism. One very popular assumption among modern scholars is that the practice arose in response to the rise of bhakti religiosity in varieties of Vaishnava or Shaiva Hinduism to serve the emotional needs of the common people. But again, there are a few problems in this assumption. First of all, there's the historical difficulty that the earliest traces of yaksha worship in Jainism are clearly very much older than the upsurge of modern Bhakti Hinduism starting around 600 AD. And secondly, if it is objected that the place and function of yakshi worship in Jainism do not fit in with the Jaina atheistic worldview with its emphasis on ethics and renunciation, and therefore yaksha worship must be Hindu, then one is using a very vague concept of Hinduism indeed. Rather than wondering which doctrinally codified religion borrowed what from which other one, I believe another question is far more important. Why should anything be borrowed at all? What is the meaning of a story like the one of Padmavati in the cave? What is the point of integrating the worship of a goddess like Padmavati in a religion like Jainism, in which its foremost religiously exemplary personalities are renouncers or tyagis? I believe this question itself already provides at least half of the answer. The fact is that we experience the troubles of samsara, and as long as we have not attained moksha, we must find ways of dealing with them. Indian religious and philosophical thought has, throughout its very long history, had an open attitude towards phenomena which in the Western world we call parapsychological, paranormal, or occult. Ways of paranormal cognition have been recognized as valid means of knowledge. For instance, in Jainism, we have concepts like avadijnana, manahparyaya jnana, kevala jnana. In Vaishnava thought, there is yogi pratyaksha, which in English would be called paragnostic abilities. In my opinion, the stories about Padmavati seem to be reports of contacts with a not entirely mundane realm of reality. A realm of experience which cannot be expressed in ordinary worldly terms, but only in symbolic ones. The scanty mention of yakshas in the Jaina Agamas and the relatively far more elaborate treatment of them and of similar beings in the Tattvartha Sutra are evidence that from these early times onwards, Jaina thinkers have recognized and not just dismissed such experiences. Questions like, is Padmavati actually nothing but a Jainified version of the Hindu Manasa or of Kali are not appropriate. I can imagine that here we are dealing with a symbolic meta-language in which people within the Jaina tradition try to come to terms with certain experiences of phenomena that are shared also with people outside the Jaina tradition. And therefore, there's also a shared symbolism. And therefore, Padmavati, just like Jwalamalini, just like Kushmandini, or Saraswati for that matter, or any of the other lower deities, is not borrowed from Hinduism, nor vice versa, nor do the Hindus, did they borrow this from Jainism. I believe that all this belongs to a very ancient realm of experience that is pre-philosophical, pre-doctrine, and has a degree of universality that is recognized across Indian denominational boundaries. And for this reason, there is nothing wrong about nominal Hindus coming to Homboja and to other Jaina kshetras to seek the blessings of the goddess. On the the contrary, as I mentioned earlier, it is considered perfectly natural. And personally, I believe this is very beautiful. So with this, I would like to stop my presentation. And I thank all of you very much for your patience in listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zydenbos, for this nice presentation.
I wanted to ask you, does Padmavati's partner, Bhairava, because it's a Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa that you've been talking about, so does Padmavati's partner, Bhairava, appear ritually at the Home Puja festival? In posing this question, I am thinking of Ranakpur, because in this beautiful giant temple of Ranakpur, which is also to Parshvanath in Rajasthan, there is a pillar bearing the statue of Bhairava, and they likewise have an occasion when huge numbers of pilgrims come primarily to worship the Bhairava on that particular pillar, because we've actually witnessed that. And many of them fall into trance. So this is well known. The primary focus is a Bhairava, not Parshvanatha, who's a tranquil, transcendent deity. So I was a bit surprised that there was no mention of Bhairava in the, at the Home Puja festival, especially because in the story, the goddess told the shepherd that if he revealed her presence, his head would burst. And his head actually burst. And, this seems to be a reflection of the decapitation scenario for the goddess, a tantric decapitation scenario, which we find all the time with Bhairava stories in the Hindu context. So, yeah, the question is, where is Bhairava in this festival? So then I have another observation, but I'll let you answer first, please.
Yeah. Well, about Bhairava, first of all, I must confess, I'm not an expert on Bhairava. Padmavati's consort is Dharanendra. And the title of this text, which I refer to, Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa, it does not refer to a separate person who is Bhairava. It is it's an adjective that it says something about the character of Padmavati. Padmavati, who is also called Bhairavi, has this ferociousness which appears in some of these stories, like what you mentioned just now, that this shepherd in the story does not abide by his promise. He breaks his promise, and he's punished for this. This is a theme which we find in several Padmavati stories. She demands loyalty, and she makes a pact with you. And if you keep your promise, she will help you. If you no longer keep your promise, if you show any kind of lack of gratitude, for instance, in the main story about Jinadatta, she will abandon you. So the character of Padmavati is not that of a kind, loving, forgiving, motherly character, which is, there's a different Yakshi, that is the Yakshi Ushmandini, whose main shrine is in Shravanabelgula. She is like that, different personality. She's very kind, gentle, loving, forgiving. Jvanamalini is not. Padmavati is rather ambiguous. So that is what the Bhairava in many texts about Padmavati refers to. Also in tantric mantras that are addressed to Padmavati, a number of characteristics are given, and one of them is that she is Bhairava.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The second question is regarding the various attempts to resolve this seeming inner contradiction within Jainism. including that of John Cott, which you've described. So my question is, why not approach this quote unquote inner contradiction from the perspective of acculturation, historical acculturation? For example, in the story of Jinadatta, we see that the tribals play a very important role. In fact, they seem to be the center or the reason in the narrative for the seemingly non-Jain practices. And this is true not just of Jainism, but also of Buddhism and Hinduism. For example, this Jagannath worship, which is now such a big pan-Indian festival, the story behind it is that an Aryan prince marrying the daughter of a tribal chieftain, and that is why the worship of Jagannath is so different. You know, it's a wooden murti, it looks like tribal, there are tribal priests. So all the three religions, Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism have had to, I mean, when they are trying to convert, tribals and other people who are beyond the boundaries, they had to somehow accommodate these practices. So there's a process of acculturation going on across the whole subcontinent, talking about Bab, Lawrence Bab. So in the case of Buddhist Tantricism, this has been clearly demonstrated because they have their equivalent deities like Chakra Samvara, which is basically has the attributes of the Hindu Bhairava, or they even have Vajra Bhairava. So it seems to me that all three religions were competing for people, because a large part of India was actually tribal. These religions were slowly expanding into different corners of India. So why not, look at it from that perspective as well? I'm not negating the other perspective.
Well, I think there is very much to say for that. Only, why should there be acculturation? There can be different reasons for that. One very commonly given reason, and this is typical for the social sciences as far as I have read them, is that it is a matter of political influence. That you have a religious tradition competing with another tradition, that other tradition has something new. And let us make it more concrete. We have the Jainas, and they see that there is a rise in popularity of new forms of Hinduism, new forms of Vaishnavism, Shaivism, with a strong bhakti element. And then the Jainas say, oh my goodness, we need something similar. Otherwise, people will walk away and they will join the other religion. And then they invent an object or several objects for bhakti. This may have played a role. I will not rule out that possibility completely. But as I mentioned earlier, the presence of the yakshis and yakshas goes back much further than the rise of the Hindu bhakti traditions in their now classical form. And I think that there are also other important reasons. Why should the yakshis have been there in the first place? Why do we see that, and this is a description of an episode in the life of Mahavira, which we find in the Shvetambara Agamas. It is said that Mahavira, he had renounced the world. He traveled on foot, but he had to spend the nights somewhere. And it is said in, I forget which text is that, I forgot exactly, but it's one of the oldest agamas, that he avoided the Brahminical sites for yagas and yajnas because that was a different cult, and it involved violence and animal offerings. And instead, he preferred to spend the nights in yakshastanas. And we find very, very brief descriptions of what a yakshastana is. It's a building, and in the building, there's an image of the yaksha, and the yaksha is worshipped with flowers. And this is non-violent, and therefore it was more agreeable to Mahavira. So in other words, we have there a tradition that predates Mahavira. It was already there. It is also something that is not a part of the Vedic tradition, because the Brahmins, they had their yaga styles, and that was something entirely different. We have here something that is very ancient, and that is why I called it pre-philosophical, pre-doctrinal, prehistorical in its origins. And there must be reasons for this. And my personal conviction is that if we compare this kind of veneration of the Yakshis in Jainism, or the so-called folk goddesses in various forms of Hinduism, that we will find a religiously psychological common ground. If we leave out later theories, the later intellectualization, which involves what Kort calls ideology, if we leave out the later theories and we focus only on what phenomenologically is there, so what do these people do? What is the iconography like? There is a murti that is an object of worship. What does the murti look like? How is it venerated? What do people think? What do they feel during worship? I think that we will find something fundamentally similar, which later thinkers, the various philosophers, and they can be Jaina philosophers, they can be Buddhist philosophers, they can be various kinds of Hindu philosophers, they wanted to make sense out of this, using their own concepts, their own terminology, and this led to different interpretations. And therefore, I hesitate to say that, as other scholars rather automatically do, that, oh, this is not Jaina, it must have been borrowed from somebody else. I don't think so. I think that everybody has borrowed it from an earlier common religious practice.
Yeah, the point I was making was that such acculturation has been going on from the very earliest prehistorical times, which is exactly what you're saying. I wasn't trying to reduce it to bhakti movements competing with each other. That's very late. And it's yeah, I wasn't actually suggesting that it was competition based on bhakti. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, so thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt. Actually, we are running late. We have crossed our time limit. I know there are many questions. I can see here the symbols of raise hand. But as we are running late, I request the chair of the session, our president, Dr. Sugat Jain, for his remark. Sushilji, please make him co-host so that he can, yes. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I must thank Professor Zydenbos for starting with a case study of a region that in Karnataka, where the worship of goddess, especially Padmavati, was dealt in details, the rituals, the places, and then he went into various aspects from sociological point of view, from philosophical point of view, from traditional point of view. My personal feeling is that we call something like Shiism in a religion. We spoke of that the proponents of a philosophy or a religion, they get weak. It starts affecting the leaders, the society's leaders also, and then they start looking around. So in this we see that we drifted from veneration, which is one of the aspects for Jains, in which we recite the virtues of the Tirthankars. Now, later on, it got converted into puja, or worship. And in philosophically, worship itself is not supported by Jain philosophy. It is a effect of the majority community. And people who are not very common people, they start seeing what looks good, involves them in rituals so that they can be busy. And this process has been going on. We see first of all, we had yakshas and yakshinis along with the idol of the Tirthankars. So we used to worship only the Tirthankars, but they were there. Then over a period of time, we started drifting, not understanding the philosophy. So we replaced the Tirthankara by goddess like Padmavati. So you see Padmavati there and Parshana sitting on top of a very small size. Why is because we, as he says, that from moksha, we are drifting to wellness. We are drifting towards wellness. That means our, physical problems or our worldly problems. And we seek blessings or support of Padmavati, whom we feel has some powers, some supernatural powers of Parashnas. So I think this process is going on. And I was surprised when I go around India that how the temples even are getting converted from the Jaina temples to Padmavati temples. And even in complexes where there is a Jaina temple and a goddess temple, 90% people will not go to the temple, Jaina temple. They will stay at Padmavati temple and have, loud music, lot of offerings, get busy in doing something and thinking that they will be bestowed with some blessing of Padmavati. So as you said, we cannot take it from a kunda views of Vyavahane or Nishchane. This I would say more as a tradition. We are getting carried away by the tradition rather than from some philosophical aspect or some other aspect. So this is as a practicing Jain and studying philosophy, to me it causes a lot of concern to see this drift. Then I see what can I do? This is a change which is taking place, and I think in 15-20 years you will see no difference between Jainism and the majority religion. This year I'm talking of Digambar Jains. In Shwetambar Jains, if you see, they have even made the Tirthankaras the kings, adored them with diamonds and other things. So all these things are taking place more for, bringing the other major traditions. So I think this was a very good discussion, and it will cause some thinking in the academia to go more into why. It is not just Nishchane or Vyavahane. This is just an impact of the society, the societal impact, where we find, because this is not leading to moksha marga, which is the principle, drift for later there are options. So this is all I can say. It is doing the Jains, the ordinary Jains who come together and form a community. That's all I can say. So that way it is a good practice that is going on. So Professor Zydenbos, thank you very much. You have been associated with ISJS, whether it is through the Ferodia Museum or through our online lectures. I really thank you, and I look forward for your continued association on different aspects of our activities. So thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Pandey.
Yes, I think Professor Zydenbos is. Yes, you like to say something, Professor Zydenbos.
Yes, I want to avoid a possible misunderstanding. What I perhaps did not emphasize, or no, I think I didn't mention it at all, is that the practice of Yaksha and Yakshi worship, also among the traditional Digambara Jainas in Karnataka, is completely optional. Nobody forces you to do this. Just as nobody forces you to go to any temple, because ultimately what matters is inner transformation. So you don't need Dravya Puja for that. Bhava Puja is what matters. And there is even within the community of Munis a very strong controversy of how this tradition of Yakshi worship should be considered. I was once in a small town in southern Karnataka with a large Jaina minority. And at the edge of this town, there was a hill. It was called Padmavati Hill. And there was a Padmavati Murti there. And this was a focal point of religious rituals for the entire town. It was not only the Jainas. And everybody said, yes, this is Padmavati's hill. It is a Jaina site. But she's not only there for the Jainas, she's also there for the various Hindus, also there for the Muslims. And everybody joined in annual celebrations until one day, a Digambara Muni with a few of his followers preached against this practice. And one day they destroyed this centuries-old murti. And everybody was outraged, apart from these few followers of the Muni. And then something unprecedented happened. One of the leaders of the majority Jaina community in that town told this Muni, Maharaj, I advise you to leave as quickly as possible, which he did. And for a very long time afterwards, this act by the Muni caused religious tension between the communities because everybody considered this Jaina shrine as something common, but belonged to all of them. And then came this Muni and destroyed it. 2 or 3 months after that, I spoke with another Muni who was this first Muni's brother. They were siblings from the same family. Both of them had become Munis. And I carefully asked this second Muni, Chaitanya Sagara, about his brother, Niyama Sagara. And Chaitanya Sagara radically disagreed with his brother. He said, this is very bad. He should not have done that. It benefits nobody. It is a sort of, and the younger brother considered this a sort of Puritan fundamentalist radicalism in his elder brother, which he condemned. And so here we have 2 Munis from the same family, born as brothers, with radically different views on the matter. Thank you.
Okay. You really brought a very good point. Now, I will give you some examples in the north. This Bhattarak Parampara from the south, they started coming to India, towards north also, along with the rituals as we have seen there. But from time to time, we see people standing up like Banarsi Das, during Akbar's time. Then we have Todarmal. Then we had Taran Swami, who removed the, murtis and replaced by textbooks. And recently we have Kanji Swami, who are deadly against worship. When they do, perform worship, but very little offering or no offering at all. So you see, there are some corrective action also. But the majority, as you said, when you try to bring all the communities together, when you go into numbers, then these things start taking over. So let us see how it goes. It's an evolutionary process.
Okay. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Zydenbos. Thank you for your well prepared presentation and for your time for ISJS.